all good. So welcome again to our second part of our episode with Laura. Laura, in this part, we are going to be discussing all about the diaspora. So would you like to start by sharing with the audience what your PhD is all about?
Sure. Okay. So I'm researching the Yemeni diaspora and specifically how they're mobilizing in the conflict in Yemen.
Okay.
So I've been looking on a theoretical level at how we understand diaspora, like what is diaspora, how do we define it, which is something that people have very different perspectives
Correct.
on. So some people think of diaspora as just anyone who's migrated from a place. Other people, towards the other end of the spectrum, think that it means that someone is very politically engaged with what's happening and is actively engaging and trying to change the kind of political and social dynamics within their homeland, and then basically everything in between. I tend to land somewhere around the middle where there's always migration, whether it's that person themselves or their parents or grandparents, someone in their family history has migrated from a homeland, and there is that sense of a homeland, right? So there's like a connection, usually a cultural connection as a baseline, and sometimes also like a political connection or a family connection as well to that homeland. I've also been looking at how people in diasporas form communities. And a lot of that is rooted in their identity. So a lot of the things that we've been talking about in the other episode, in terms of how people identify, what the different kind of sources of identity are, how those kind of sources of cultural production vary based on where they're located and their kind of diasporic experience. And how that encourages people or creates barriers for people engaging and mobilizing politically in the affairs of their home state.
Okay.
And I've researched this specifically in the case of Yemen. So looking at how Yemenis, particularly in the years since 2011, so after the Arab Spring, there was a big kind of political upheaval, and then obviously the civil war, and how Yemenis have engaged with what's been happening in their homeland. And I've been speaking to Yemenis all over the world. So from the UK, the US, Canada, Europe, to also the Middle East, the Gulf states, Egypt, and even further afield in places like Southeast Asia. There's a big Yemeni diaspora community in Southeast Asia, East Africa, and looking at how those experiences have differed, how their diasporic experience has varied across all of these different contexts, and how this has impacted their identity, how they experience their culture, whether it's their Yemeni culture or the culture of the host state or various other kind of competing factors in their identity and their culture. And how they're forming communities. And a big piece of my research has been focused around how the internet and social media are really transforming all of these processes. So from the very way that we understand diaspora, like what is a diaspora now, this looks very different in the digital age, in the age of the internet and social media. And people are, forming their identity, their culture, their communities in very different ways than they were even 10 years ago.
Correct.
And this is also creating new opportunities and barriers for political mobilization in their homeland.
Wow. You said you were almost done with your PhD, so I think you've done a lot of research. But on that note, why did you choose Yemen per se?
So I've been interested in Yemen for a long time. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on Yemen actually in 2014, and I started writing it, or I was writing up my thesis actually in the summer of 2014 when the Houthis came down from the mountains and there was the coup in Sana'a, and that really fundamentally shifted Yemeni politics. And so I did my undergraduate and my master's degree in the politics of the region, and particularly looking at conflict-affected countries. And I think from being in Oman, I also had a deep interest in the Arabian Peninsula and in this particular kind of corner of the region. And after I finished my degree, I'd always maintained an interest in Yemen, although I've never been, because I started researching it when the conflict began.
It's very hard to go there.
Exactly. And so part of the reason why I ended up focusing on the diaspora was just a purely practical level, in that I knew I wouldn't be able to travel to Yemen to do my research. And so it was like a lens of examining the conflict without having to travel. But then actually over time, I realized that this is actually something I'm very interested in and on a lot of different levels. And it kind of brings together a lot of the other areas of interest for me. So, for example, we talked about pink gin and how I've been connecting with people from across the region and in the diaspora, and engaging with issues of conflict and migration and displacement, and it all kind of fitted together in a way that I didn't really expect, and has become something I've become increasingly interested in since I started a few years ago.
Oh, wow. So talking about the diaspora, and you mentioned that you also kind of, you got involved in a lot of different communities from all around the world. So what was maybe something that you learned about all those different communities, or how does it differ from one place to the next, regardless of the fact that they all come from the same place?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm referring specifically to the Yemeni communities that I studied.
And then we can expand from there.
Yeah. But there's huge diversity in the different communities in terms of the different geographical communities.
Okay.
So, like, for example, Yemeni communities in the Gulf experience their identity and their connection to Yemen in a very different way than Yemenis in the UK, for example. And then even within the UK, I focus quite a lot on the UK for my research. There's a lot of diversity between the different geographical communities in different cities. And I think it always comes down to their individual experience, the experience of migration, their experience in the homeland, in terms of, where they are from regionally, their kind of culture and their cultural identity and heritage, how they've experienced the host state as well. And we talked a little bit in the last episode around how identity often forms in resistance to certain things, and you see that a lot in within diaspora communities. So, like, for example, in the UK, Yemenis in the UK have experienced racism, and have had to kind of attempt to integrate into a community that has not always been receptive of them and of their presence there. And I think experiences like that definitely have an impact on how they understand their Yemeniness and also their Britishness, like how they interact with Britain as well. And there's also this notion, this kind of famous notion of diaspora communities being frozen in time.
Please do tell.
So in certain communities, especially very kind of tight cultural communities or ethnic communities, like, for example, in the UK, if you go to a city like Birmingham, you'll find a lot of Yemenis all living in very close proximity within one neighborhood. Like, I was driving around with a Yemeni guy who was showing me around the neighborhood, and he's literally telling me, okay, this is Yemen, this is Afghanistan, this is Bangladesh, and just identifying these different communities, and they can kind of exist and develop within a bubble. And within that bubble, culture can kind of develop in a very specific way.
Of course.
And again, sometimes that's in resistance to the local culture of the host state. And there's often a very intense desire to hold on to one's culture or homeland, culture. And so in the case of a lot of the Yemenis that I spoke to in the UK, for example, the communities there tend to be quite religiously conservative, because religion, I guess, is an aspect of culture that you can hold on to.
Agreed.
In different places. You may not have access to the food. You may not want to be wearing traditional dress, to sending your kids to school wearing traditional dress or whatever. Like, there's certain elements that are more difficult to really live in your daily behaviors and practices. Correct. But religion is one of the things that you can hold on to. Yeah. And Islam is so closely associated for many Yemenis with their Yemeni identity as 100%. Well. And so you have this idea that you have this idea that Yemenis, for example, who migrated from the 1960s, you hear this a lot, other Yemenis who have migrated since will say, the Yemenis who migrated in the 60s are like Yemen in the 60s. Because they've kept the culture from that time, while actually within Yemen,
things have evolved and changed and developed.
Everything's constantly evolving, whereas in the diaspora, you're actively trying to hold on to that culture as it was when you left. And of course, all of that is changing now with the internet and social media, because people have whole new levels of exposure to the ways that culture is evolving in the homeland, which they just didn't before. Like, I spoke to Yemenis who told me when they grew up, their kind of cultural influences were the immediate community around them. And then it would be things like cassette tapes that their grandmas would
Yeah.
record and send and
That's
everything.
true.
And now it's like they're constantly there on Instagram, they're on Twitter, on social media, they're seeing everything all the time. And so they have much more exposure to the culture and kind of
What's
cultural
happening.
production and the ways that identities are shifting in the homeland, and then combine that as well with cultural influences from outside, from the host state, from all over. It's transforming the way that people are forming their kind of sense of identity and sense of their cultural heritage. And I would love to actually hear this in I'm throwing some quite theoretical stuff at you based on my research, but I would love to hear your experience of that as someone in the Lebanese diaspora who has existed both within the diaspora in the UK and in the Gulf, and how those communities have differed and how you've experienced that kind of identity formation process.
I think what you mentioned when it comes to people who have left, let's say, back in the day, that is something that I completely agree with. And if I want to speak specifically, let's talk about Lebanese people, right? You have a lot of people who have left back in the day. And I think because they left maybe at a very young age when probably there was no internet, there was no media, you feel like they really are trying to hold on to what they, to their own kind of identity or heritage. And you feel like once they come back, regardless of the fact that a lot of people have developed in certain ways, or regardless of the fact that the country has kind of, evolved in different ways, they still kind of have that mentality or that mindset. And we see a lot of those people, let's say, in the States or in a lot of different places in Europe, who the new generation has a completely different way of thinking compared to them. And this actually brings me to another topic that I brought up in one of the other episodes about the fact that so if you choose to leave a certain place, is it the same as you being forced to leave a certain place? And how does that kind of shape who you are as a person? Do you hold on to your heritage and to your culture more when you're kind of forced to leave a certain place? Or is it that when you're, when you're choosing, it's like, I'm choosing to explore the world, I'm choosing to look at things differently, I'm choosing to expose myself and be open, versus having to leave a place and when you're being forced to leave a place, you kind of want to hold on to whatever you can. And I've seen that with the current situation, right? With the people that have also chosen to leave the country, the fact that now they feel that they can't go back brings a sense of, I'm not sure how to say it, but it brings a sense of extra belongingness to that community. So you're like, oh no, I want to go back now, and I want to, I want to hold on to that heritage. And, Debke is a big thing, and now everyone needs to learn that. And, we have to start speaking Arabic again. And surprisingly, when they were still in the country, probably it wasn't that case, right? And I think this is contradicting at one point, but at the same time, it's just sometimes circumstances that enforce these things on you. Yeah. Or, as you mentioned in the previous episode, you don't know, or you don't appreciate something until you kind of feel like you're going to lose it. Yeah. And I feel like this is what it is for a lot of people experiencing or a lot of people who are part of the diaspora. Yeah. For them, it's like they don't appreciate what they have until they lose it. And so sometimes when you're out of your country or you're forced to leave, you're like, you reminisce on certain memories. You feel very nostalgic sometimes, and so that's why it becomes very dear to your heart. And I think it's both. I don't think it's beautiful. I think it's sad at one point, but at the same time, it also creates a big identity crisis in a lot of different areas. Because at one point you want to belong to the place that you're in, you want to hold on to what you have, you want to evolve with the world, but you don't know where you stand, right? Versus the people who have made a choice. Yeah. So.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of really interesting things there. I mean, one is how intertwined culture and politics are, right?
Oh, big time.
Like, and how politics influences culture.
Yeah.
And how the homeland influences the culture of the diaspora, and the diaspora influences the culture of the homeland and the politics of the homeland. And you see this a lot. You've seen it for a long time in the Palestinian case.
Yeah.
In the sense that people facing cultural erasure will hold on to their culture, double down on their culture. So cultural symbols of Palestine have become symbols of the political resistance as well. So things like the watermelon, like the tetris, and I don't know. I've kind of I was kind of in touch with a few people who work to preserve the Palestinian cultural heritage and tetris, the embroidery, before this happened. But the last year, I've seen an explosion of people doing it. Everybody's doing the tetris, the cross stitch. Everybody's engaging in these traditional practices, because it's political as well as cultural. It's a way of holding on to that culture and defending your right to exist.
That's true.
So there's that element, which is how politics influences the cultural experience.
It does.
And that goes back to what we were saying before about how the different people's experiences in the diaspora affect their identity and their culture, and the circumstances of their migration are a huge part of that. Huge. And then on the flip side of that, you have people who have made the choice to leave, who then often face this kind of struggle for legitimacy when they go back home.
True.
Which can also kind of adds to this sense of, do I belong here? Do I belong there? I belong both and neither.
At
not
the
really
same
feeling
time.
like you belong or can speak legitimately on behalf of the people in the homeland.
Correct.
And we certainly see this in the case of Yemen, in that it's not like Syria or in that the majority of the displaced people in Yemen have been displaced internally within Yemen. Very few people have actually been able to migrate because of Yemen's geographical position, because of countries closing their borders and restrictions around visas. And so the Yemenis who have been able to leave really struggle with that, in the sense that they tend to come from certain kinds of backgrounds. I'm generalizing here, but often it tends to be more educated Yemenis who have perhaps been able to get scholarships, or who have gone on medical visas to, like Egypt, for example, has let a lot of Yemenis migrate for medical reasons, who have then stayed. But those kind of political factors majorly influence where people are able to go, and how they experience the community when they get there. So in the Yemeni case in the UK, for example, I spoke with a few Yemenis in London, younger Yemenis who had migrated, who had been able to leave on scholarships and then claimed asylum, who were living in London, who were very politically engaged with what's happening in their homeland, because they left, in the last 10, 15 years. And they struggle sometimes, or people have expressed that they struggle with the existing communities in the UK who are maybe not quite so switched on with the politics, who are just kind of wanting to get on with their lives. Often it's second, third generation who don't have the same connection. And so that's a struggle for them as well, in terms of relating to other people in that place, in the host state.
No, that's true. I mean, I completely agree with you, because for people who have probably left a long time ago, maybe that generation holds on to the heritage, but then their children and grandchildren don't have any connection, unfortunately, to their homeland or to their country. So they don't consider that place probably, they consider it a place where they've been, but they might not necessarily consider it their homeland anymore, right?
I think that's changing actually with social media. I think the younger generation in the past, so I spoke with Yemenis who had told me in the past they would only hear about Yemen through like sitting in a majlis with their grandparents. Who would be telling stories, and it would be super nostalgic, and it would, be very kind of, it was all through their eyes. Whereas now they're seeing it for themselves. They're connecting with they're speaking to their cousins every day. They're visually seeing their hometown or the village where they came from or whatever, or the kind of the visual elements of their cultural heritage, and they're able to connect with that in a completely different way than they were even 10 years ago. And actually you're seeing a lot of younger people really bringing that into both their sense of identity and also their activism. So for example, a couple of the women that I spoke to in the UK, there was an amazing woman living in Liverpool who's a poet and political activist, and she does like creative writing workshops with kids, and she deals with issues like racism and xenophobia, and she's very much stands in solidarity with Palestine, and she interweaves all of these different causes together. But her Yemeni identity is present in all of it. And it's really beautiful to see how she's using poetry as a medium to express that.
Oh, that's a nice way instead of politics.
Well, I mean, it's very political,
yeah.
but yes. And then there was another woman who, I think she's in her early 20s. She's super young. She's a fashion designer. And she lives in Sheffield, and there's a big Yemeni community in Sheffield. And she was creating these beautiful designs, and it's kind of streetwear, but with traditional Yemeni elements. And so she's bringing together these two pieces of her identity that she's able to engage with on the one hand on a deeper level through social media, but also she's able to project that and amplify that through social media now herself. They're using their platforms as well to talk about Yemen and to project their Yemeni heritage.
Do you think that because, I mean, social media has obviously its pros and cons, right? And a big... a very positive side to social media is the fact that people are now more connected. You know, they can see what's going on. They can connect with the people back home. But do you feel that because of social media, a lot of people feel maybe the need to, I don't know if it's to belong necessarily, but because of the fact that if I know that my origin, let's say, is, I don't know, Indian, for example, probably I haven't been born and raised in India, but now that, you know, social media is so exposed, now that I know a lot, do you feel that I have the sense of curiosity to kind of say, yeah, you know, let me explore that a bit more? Because I feel like I've been seeing it in a lot of different people who have probably not been born and raised in their, let's say, original hometown. But then suddenly as they grow up, they kind of feel like they want to connect back to that. And I'm not sure if it's because along the way they felt like, I'm not really finding myself in the other places, or, you know, maybe that is where I really am from, or this is, you know, part of my identity and I kind of want to bring it out. So it's also part of like exploring yourself. I don't know your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. I think I absolutely agree with that. I think, like you said, there's kind of positives and negatives to it. From what I've seen through my research, social media is enabling people to kind of self-select their own identity and on the basis of that, self-select their community based on people who have had similar experiences.
Correct.
And also similar political views as well.
True.
On, for example, on what's happening in their homeland. And in the case of Yemen, it's been incredibly polarized, and that polarization has transcended to the diaspora as well, and it's polarized communities along political lines. And so you have people who have maybe spoken out in favor of peace, or who have like a non-aligned position on the conflict, who have faced a lot of pushback from people within the diaspora, both offline and online. But through social media, they've been able to connect with other people who share that outlook or who share that experience. For example, you see it a lot with women, Yemen is a relatively conservative society. Some of the Yemeni communities in the diaspora have really held on to that conservatism, which we've spoke about already. And they've struggled in that they have come up against that. But they're finding commonality in the experiences of other Yemeni women who also share their political perspectives, who share their kind of degree of social liberalism or whatever. And they're forming these virtual communities of people in different countries around the world and in Yemen. And that's their Yemeni community now, as opposed to it being their local community of Yemenis. So that has been really positive, I think, for people who have struggled to find that sense of belonging. It's created new opportunities for them to find that and to create that. But then on the flip side of that, I think it's the same challenges around, we all exist in our own echo chamber online, right?
That's true.
And so often we might think, well, everybody agrees with us and we know everything and we're being exposed to everything and seeing everything, but we're not. The case, we never are. And it's really interesting observing that in the diaspora, not just the Yemeni diaspora, but the Arab diaspora in the UK and particularly in London. I think social media, from what I'm seeing now, it feels like there's more solidarity among different Arab diasporas online at least.
Yes,
even if
agreed.
primarily they're engaged with their own cause, there's a lot more solidarity, and particularly the last year. But then at the same time, you see their kind of views on the world have also evolved within a very specific context, which is growing up in a Western cosmopolitan city like London, which is very kind of, politically left-wing, very international, very progressive debates happening around certain issues, around things that people in the region, in their homelands, might not relate to at all.
No, I agree.
And so for an example is one of the debates that's been happening in recent years around decolonization, like decolonizing our minds, decolonizing academic curriculums, decolonizing our language. There's been this movement towards talking about the Middle East, or the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, as Southwest Asia and North Africa instead. So the SWANA, this is like the new name in like liberal diaspora circles in the West for the region. And yet I've kind of raised that and mentioned that to people in the region, and they're just like, what? This doesn't mean anything to us.
Because they're living in it, right?
Exactly.
So they don't feel the same sense.
Well, yeah, and it's not that it's wrong that they're having those conversations around, well, how can we decolonize this language? Actually, there's a lot of value in these conversations, but they are happening in a very specific context.
Correct.
That's not necessarily the same, as the context of their homelands. So it's really interesting to see how social media and echo chambers are kind of cementing those kind of ideological divides in a way between the homeland and diaspora, at the same time as they're also connecting people. So it's a lot more complicated than it being either it's positive or negative. It's connecting people or disconnecting people. Often these processes are happening simultaneously.
Yeah. And I also think that, from a political side, it also depends on where you are, right? Because sometimes where you are either allows you to express yourself, or sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes this can also play a very big role in how you tend to kind of express yourself, right? In a place where you are allowed to express yourself, you're kind of more prone to certain things. But in a place where you feel like I cannot express myself, it kind of gets repressed inside. And then you're like,
what do you do with that?
What am I supposed to do? So at one point, you either find a place to talk about it, or you just kind of let it go. And I think that's something that a lot of people can't control. But at the same time, this is where you also have to make a choice on, whether I need to kind of just move on with things in my life, or I kind of need to, find another way to express. And oftentimes, really, the place that you're in has a very big impact, right? Depending on their political, let's say, geographical location, their political views, how it's being perceived, how are you being perceived in that specific country, for example. And a very small and quick example is whatever is happening now. You feel like in Oman, you can somehow talk about it, because the country stands with whatever is happening. But if you go maybe to another country, it becomes much harder. Because it has a completely different view, and you're just there listening, and you can't really do anything about it. So it becomes harder.
Totally. And we become so accustomed to speaking about it and interacting with it in a certain way. Like, I often find with the media as well, I'm exposed more to the media here, just naturally. Like, I'm not really exposed to the Western media at all.
True.
I mean, my social media is obviously, algorithms dictate that it tends to be people that agree with my perspectives.
That's true.
Which are largely more in line with the Arab media than the Western media. And so sometimes when I see Western media coverage, I'm shocked. I'm like, wait, is this seriously what the headline that, whatever outlet has published? And I find it really kind of smacks me back down to earth. Like, wow, okay, this is what the rest of the world is seeing.
Yeah. And it's the same with diasporas, right? It's the same with, the people being exposed to whatever they're exposed to in the regions that they are, whether it's about the news, whether it's about the culture, whether it's about what's going on in their homeland. It also plays a very big role. And when you're in the country, you're not as exposed to the news as people outside are as well. Or maybe you're not as interested because you're in it.
Exactly.
Right? So people, let's say, living in Lebanon might not really be exposed to the media as much as we are, glued to the TV every single day in order to see what's going on. And I think that also plays a very big role in having that sense of attachment to the place.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that comes up a lot in the academic literature around diasporas, this idea that diasporas are often more attached to kind of abstract concepts like identity or like political affiliation. And if they are kind of mobilizing, whether it's like mobilizing politically, advocating, mobilizing resources and fundraising, it tends to be in line with these kind of higher level issues.
True.
Because that's how they're experiencing what's happening. Whereas the people on the ground are just, especially in conflict affected and crisis affected countries, are concerned with survival. Like, what are the daily necessities? Like, how do we get through this day? How am I going to feed my children? And so the kind of concerns are very different and there's a bit of, that can be a divide between the two, that can lead to, again, this question of legitimacy, where often populations on the ground can feel like the diaspora are sort of out of touch. And there have been instances in certain conflicts in the past where this has driven, where diaspora is mobilizing around some of these political issues, have had negative effects on the conflict on the ground, because they've perpetuated the conflict, because they're perhaps supporting a certain party to the conflict, because they're engaging at the level of issues of their identity and what the homeland means to them, as opposed to actually the
things on the ground.
Exactly. And it's really, really hard, I think. It's really, really hard for people in the diaspora to navigate that, because there's this huge sense of responsibility, and then the kind of the survivor's guilt that a lot of people talk about. Feeling like, well, I'm here, I'm safe, I need to use my, my
voice
privilege
or my
and my positionality to do something. But then it takes a huge amount of awareness and access to knowledge and information that you maybe don't always have, in order to engage in a way that's actually effective and not going to sometimes do more harm. It's such a hard line to tread.
It is. No, I agree. I mean, it's an ongoing topic, right? I don't think there's a right or wrong in this case. Some people do feel guilty. And sometimes there are people who just kind of go on with their lives and nothing is right or wrong, right? Yeah. But I don't know where judgment falls into that as well.
Or if it does, like, often people are traumatized by what's happening, and are just dealing with it in whatever way they can. Yeah.
I think this is where also empathy comes in. I mean, judgment from one side, of course, when it comes to maybe, let's say, if we're talking specifically about Yemen right now, then you might have certain communities who are really outspoken, and you might have certain communities that are just kind of going on with their lives. And in both cases, you don't want any judgment, right? You don't want someone saying, oh, why aren't you active enough? Look what's going on in your country. And at the same time, it's not their place, right? And I feel like a lot of people might also get shamed for this. I'm talking about all diasporas, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people might get shamed for the fact that they're either not talking about it a lot, or they're not doing anything, or they're not participating in a certain act. When in fact, people should just kind of also have that empathetic side to say, whatever is going on with you, that's up to you. I'm not involved, right? It's not my place. It's not my place to tell you what to do. It's not my place to tell you if you need to be active or you need to kind of, stay silent. And I think this is where a lot of conflicts also come up within the same, I'm going to say within the same nationality. Because a lot of people might kind of blame you for doing certain things. And this is where if you did not feel guilty, then this is where you might feel guilty, or this is where you might be very aggressive towards the other party as well.
Yeah, and I guess social media adds another kind of level to that.
Yeah.
How much of the the activism is just stemming from that guilt, how much of it is, you know, performative to show that you're doing something because you're worried, when actually you don't know, like we don't know
Yeah.
what people are doing or how people are experiencing it.
Correct.
And I think diasporas often kind of find themselves in this damned if you don't, damned if you do situation where
Yeah.
if you don't speak out, you know, you'll feel that guilt and that shame, whether it's from other people in the diaspora or from people in the homeland who are expecting, you know, there's that sense of responsibility that, well, they're safe, they're outside, they can help us.
And if you do
If you
speak,
do,
it's like, what are you
exactly.
doing? You know, you're in a different place completely. You're safe. You're fine.
Yeah.
So what are you trying to say, right?
Yeah. It's so tough.
And I have to admit, we all think this way at one point, right? I mean,
Yeah, and it's always coming from where we're judging ourselves, right? Like
Yeah.
if we're seeing other people and we find ourselves judging what they're doing or not doing, often it comes from our own sense of whether it's guilt or pain.
that's true. No, that's true. I mean, I can give an example of what's happening right now in Lebanon, and there's a part of me sometimes that feels like, oh, you know, I need to post because I feel like there's this social pressure somehow. And this often fires back because then I have to kind of sit down and analyze myself and say, but why, like, are you doing it because of the fact that people are posting or because of the fact that people are talking about it? Or are you doing it because you really want to be outspoken? But at the same time, looking at maybe internally or looking at the fact that we live in a region where, you know, it's hard to kind of move from one place to another, and that can also create another conflict because internally you're like, okay, sometimes I prefer not to post because I don't want it to seem negative in the place that I'm actually in right now. Or you know, there are people with certain passports that have visa issues, for example, right? And sometimes when you're applying for a certain visa, people check your social media, and sometimes that might be taken in a completely negative way. And so I feel like, and this is my internal experience, right? But this can also be a conflict for a lot of other people. Or sometimes, for example, last year, when everything started in Palestine, I was pregnant during that time. And for me, it was much better for my own mental health not to watch those things. And so I completely disconnected from it. Did I feel guilty? Yes. Yeah. I felt guilty because there were a lot of people that were, you know, talking about it, or a lot of people that were posting. And I was feeling whatever I needed to feel, but at the same time, I also had a choice to make. And this is where I felt guilty because I felt that I was lucky enough probably to be pregnant, and I was lucky enough to be in a place where it's safe for me and my baby. Yeah. But at the same time, on the other hand, it was like, oh no, there's this immense amount of guilt because I'm not being able to do anything, because I am privileged, because I can deliver in a safe place. And I think a lot of people experience that. And sometimes what we really need is just people to be a bit more understanding and a bit more sensitive to the situation. And you know, just being empathetic. And I think a lot of people experience that in a lot of different ways. Yeah. You know, whether it's the Armenian diaspora, right? Or whether it's the Indian diaspora. Like, a lot of people are all over because of certain circumstances. And I'm talking about people who were forced to leave, not people who, for example, like us, have chosen to leave. That's a different case.
Yeah, it's really interesting now. People we're all very aware of the dissonance that we're experiencing right now, of being so exposed to what's happening, seeing it every day.
Correct.
In all of its horror. And then also living our normal lives. And I know that's something that a lot of people are struggling with, anyone who's engaged with what's happening, and particularly people who have a personal connection to what's happening. This is something that people have really struggled with. And I think in many ways, the rest of us, you know, the world who have been privileged enough not to have to think about this, not to have to experience this, I think we're now experiencing the dissonance that probably a lot of people in diaspora who have come from conflict-affected countries have been experiencing for a long time. Yeah. That survivor's guilt and that sense of the dissonance of, well, I'm safe living my life here while there's conflict in my homeland, and the kind of gaslighting that comes with that when nobody understands that. And I hope that the way that we're all experiencing and hyper aware of that dissonance now might make us collectively more empathetic to those experiences going forward.
Yeah, because a lot of people up until today have probably still not figured out what their identity is, right?
Yeah.
And they're still working on the process, and it gets harder with all the influences coming from a lot of different places. It becomes harder for you to really figure out who you are as a person.
And I think identity, I mean, for all of us, but certainly for diaspora communities, for individuals in the diaspora, is becoming increasingly intersectional.
Yeah.
And I think social media and the internet is kind of facilitating that, in that if you speak to people, like if you speak to a Yemeni in the UK, their identity is not just about how Yemeni are they versus how British they are, but it's their kind of, it's, yes, those sources of national identity, it's also their regional identity, their political outlook, their sexual and gender identity, and all of these different layers of identity kind of playing in together.
Crazy.
It's constantly evolving.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but I think we're becoming more aware of that, more aware of the kind of intersectionality of identity, and more exposed to different parts of ourselves. Maybe we're being kind of forced to examine ourselves more deeply because of the exposure to different sources of cultural production. And
that's true. Well, this got really deep in a good way. But to kind of sum it up, what advice would you give people who are experiencing cultural diaspora?
I mean, I don't think it's my place to give anybody advice, because everybody's got, I mean, I guess
from your own experience,
I could give advice to people who come from a similar background to me, in terms of how they engage with people experiencing what's happening. And I guess the biggest piece that's come through both of the conversations that we've had today is empathy. Is how can we show up, question every day, how can we show up with more empathy for ourselves as well, in terms of examining our experience of what's happening and our pain, and how that might be causing us to show up in certain ways that may be productive or may not be. But yeah, it's that empathy piece. How can we show up with more empathy for the people around us?
No, I agree, 100%. Laura, thank you so much for both the episodes again. I think it was very nice to kind of talk about all the different aspects, and you definitely brought in so much. I know that we can go on and on and on about a lot of those topics. But again, I thank you so much for being part of this podcast and for, sharing your knowledge and experience with everyone.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for creating this beautiful space to have these conversations. What you're doing is so valuable, and there's so much purpose in it, and I can't wait to listen to all of the other conversations you've been having.
Thank you, and much more to come. Thank you.